One of the things that I've been obsessed about in my own work recently is looking at, I'm writing a book about robo-debt and government systems and how complexity was weaponised in that sense against people who didn't understand the welfare system to be used against them. But complexity just as often just happens incidentally. It's not menacing, it's just there. And I wonder about how do we talk to regular, normal people. And I want to start with you, Michael, about how do we find people and explain to them what is actually happening using language that they understand without any of this DER, CER stuff, which is great, and you need to use it in your own lives. But when we talk to people, how do we get that message across?
That's such a great question. I was in a meeting the other day and somebody pointed out, we always hire people, engineers, scientists, policy wonks, who are very comfortable with complexity, and they design very complex programs.
Yep.
Which doesn't have to be the case. And I do think that part of it, I've always said, at least in the US, the energy industry is missing, the Madison Avenue folks from New York.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the marketing? Where's the advertising at? Like, really good marketers and advertisers can sell us practically anything and make us do whatever we want to, whether we thought we wanted to do it.
I'm the guy. I booked a trip to Oregon in the lunch break, so I didn't even know I was doing it. My fingers were just typing.
Right. See? Exactly. So it's like, where has that been in our industry, and why don't we have people who are translating this very complex? And it is, I get it. I mean, electrical engineering and building utility systems, thank goodness those people are there and helping to keep the lights on and the refrigerators running. But it doesn't mean it has to be communicated complex in a complex way, right?
Complicatedly.
Exactly.
I work with words as a profession. And I want to get the panel's thoughts on this. Alison, sometimes when I'm pitching to an editor and if I've given a garbled briefing, it's because I don't understand the story and they can pick up on it straight away. And so I'm just wondering, is it something that we need to figure out amongst ourselves first before we settle on a communication strategy, or do we know what the solutions are and we just need to figure out how to get that across?
It's such a hard question. So when I used to sit inside government, you would often get people in government who would express a huge amount of frustration with the industry because they're not asking for the one thing with a consistent voice. And it's kind of like, well, maybe that's because it's a complicated issue and there is no one thing here. But in some ways, that is the role of industry associations, right, is to kind of try and lift it up and get it to the one consistent thing. I'm not going to throw shade on Luke Menzel because I think people like the Energy Efficiency Council do a great job, but they can't cover the whole gamut of this transition. And the thing is to have an effective voice that's able to do that and advocate from an industry perspective. The industry has to get to a certain size first. It's got to have money. It's got to have companies in it who are making money and are willing to chuck money into a pot and say, go off and advocate for me so that I get, the things that I want for my business. And we've got to figure out how to grow that. The PV industry grew that really effectively, but it took a long time. It's taken us... I started out working in this field doing rebates for PV systems when it was all just a bunch of old blokes with beards banging systems together out of old car batteries.
Blokes with beards?
No, they were much older than you.
Oh, okay.
I got the impression those
their
early
beards were much less trim than yours. The sort of beard that arises from carelessness rather than... But, it took a long time for that industry to professionalise, but over time it did it, and now it is an extremely effective voice to government and voice to consumers as well. I think there's a lot to learn from that industry that maybe we haven't fully looked at and figured out. How do we do what we did in PV and do it for heat pumps, do it for... I don't think we need to do it for electric vehicles because the car company's pretty good at marketing. How do we do it for ceiling insulation? How do we, do it for helping to build in energy literacy? There's been this really long-held dream in Australia, I think, to have a energy services sector, and we've never got one. We've never managed to get one together, but that's kind of what we're we're after here. So I think we need to look at other industries that have built themselves up out of being a bunch of guys with careless beards into something that's very professional and respected and able to go and lobby, like how she just kept saying over again, you've got to fund this stuff, and you need someone whose single and sole job it is to go and bang on the door of Treasury and say, where is my money?
It honestly, annoying people works.
Yeah.
It really does,
Yeah.
In government in particular.
Yeah.
Brian, I wanted to bring you in here because you might be the pincer manoeuvre of the stage here, because I know you're focused on this stuff in Australia, but I'm wondering if you took anything from Michael Colgrove's presentation this morning about what they're doing in Oregon and how translatable that is here.
Yeah, sure. And I had the privilege of living in Oregon for a while, and I actually, there was Ryan on the screen there. I was a Ryan. I actually got an energy audit at my house, and we got a whole host of rebates. We saved so much money, we moved to Australia.
That's good.
Not actually how it worked, but I think so I was quite struck by this last panel, which I really enjoyed, because there was a good degree of sort of argy-bargy disagreement there, and I think one of the things that made me reflect on is we've jumped to this idea of a one-stop shop, but what's the problem we're trying to solve? And so if I think about that, the way I would put it is that in Australia, I think we're really good at identifying your electricity distribution network service provider. But all those words mean something together.
Allegedly.
But we look at electricity as a system that customers deserve and gas as a service that customers deserve. But actually, nobody wants those things, right? They want hot showers, cold beers, comfortable homes. Those are the energy services that we all need and require. And we don't have any entity, no one's responsible for that. And I think that's the difference between Oregon and Australia. In Oregon, there is an agency that's responsible for that. It's Michael's. Yeah.
I didn't want to. I opened my mouth briefly, and Brian saw that, and he just stopped immediately. It's like a car crash. Ron, put your economics hat on. We're talking about consumers getting involved here, but is it worth? I mean, some people really hate the idea that the government does have to set an example. They don't want government to be fully involved if they don't have to be. But what's your view here? I know we discussed it a little bit yesterday about actually getting some traction and some change. What's the signal we need?
So, Rick, when I did media training many years ago, they told me, listen to the question carefully.
Yes.
And then answer the one you wish they'd
Correct.
asked.
My job doesn't matter at all. I'm just here for fun.
But fortunately, you have asked me a question that leads me to the answer I wanted to give. So, I've been thinking very carefully, what's my sort of takeout of all of this? And it actually came out of Michael's presentation this morning. But it wasn't anything Michael said, it's what Michael didn't say.
Nice one, Michael.
No. Michael, I don't think maybe once, referred to energy consumers. He talked about customers, right? I don't know if anyone else noticed that. He always talked about customers. When Luke came up on stage, Luke asked Michael questions about energy consumers. Michael answered questions about energy customers. Now, why is this important? There's no such thing as a consumer. A consumer is an economic construct. It sits in economic textbooks. Customers exist in the real world because a customer has a contract. It might be a written contract, it might be an oral contract, it might be a deemed contract, it might be any other sort of contract. Consumers are just these abstract concepts. So we keep asking, why don't consumers do things? Well, the reason they don't do things is because they don't exist. The reason they don't respond to price signals is because they don't exist. The reason they don't do this, they don't do that. There's been a lot of discussion over the last, or a number of references over the last 2 days around rights. Now, I don't want to get into the whole rights debate. My friend Rowena will kill me if I do. But because it comes with a lot of legal baggage. But again, consumers don't have rights because they're an abstract notion. Customers do have rights. There's a whole body of law that enshrines the rights of consumers. Of customers. So
We got him, ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
yeah. So the point I'm trying to make is we have been conditioned, all of us, to think in particular ways that have to change. And that's part of the message I gave at the end of yesterday. Here is one really tangible example and why the trust works, why Michael's, why Michael's narrative resonates is because he's talking about real people.
Can I ask, Michael, is that something that you deliberately thought about or that the trust thought about?
Yeah, and I would say didn't even start with the trust or with Energy Trust. It's been kind of an arc of communication in the utility sector. Utilities used to refer to them as meters. Right? Then they kind of learned, well, maybe we should refer to them as ratepayers at least, because they're paying into it. And then we talked about them as consumers, and then finally came around. And there's actually even now conversation about what's beyond customer. Mm-hmm. And I think you heard that in the last panel a lot. Like, it's not just customer in the sense of a transactional construct, right? Now it's partner, or it's co-designer, or whatever the right word is. I don't think we've landed on that yet. But it's really how are you bringing them in to the conversation, because ultimately that's what we're trying to all do, is be in service to what the recipients of electricity or gas are getting, right? And I just say that as sort of a placeholder for whatever the right word is. And I think but it is, it's deliberate in the sense that we have to be aware of it.
Yeah, because I think it does colour so much about what happens after. I mean, language creates the world that you live in, right?
It's also why you won't hear us, and I love that Ashley brought that, we don't refer to people as hard to reach.
Yeah.
Nobody is hard to reach. You just haven't done a good enough job trying to reach them.
Well, if you don't put out your arms, you're not reaching anyone.
Exactly.
You've got to try first.
Right. Or low income is another great example. Anybody you meet who might earn less money rarely refers to themselves as low income. And so when you're promoting an offer for low income customers and people don't see themselves in that language, you shouldn't be surprised that they don't apply.
No, and
right?
the irony is it's the other way around for people who are actually middle to upper income. They think they earn a lot less than they actually do. Yeah. Brian, I mean, do we have to change energy consumers in Australia? I know you probably don't have it here. Sorry. Sorry, Brendan.
Yes, I'm going to pen.
Consumers is written up here about 500 times, but...
Brendan's looking very nervous. Yeah. I think he was expecting this was going to be on his agenda.
No, but I do think that the point about partners and communities is really important. I think one of the things that really also struck me about that last conversation, but also, there's this other thing happening that we're not really talking about at this conference about community batteries, which are one of the worst named things. I think consumers are poorly named. These are network assets. No one's ever called it a community transformer. But they've come up with this name. But it's had this unintended or maybe even intended consequence of invigorating communities around energy. And that was a lot of what was on this stage just a minute ago, was this invigoration of communities to go look after energy. And I think that's a really positive thing. So to me, actually, the lack of a trust, the lack of a responsible entity to help consumers, which is absolutely required, in my view, there has been an unintended good consequence of that, which is you've got groups of consumers doing what Aussies do well, which is like looking after themselves and trying to solve the problem themselves. We can't stop that. We want to put more oxygen on that flame while also finding a way to make sure that there is someone responsible overall. There's some entity. It could be the network. It could be a new, Energy Trust of Australia. It could be some one-stop shop. Whatever it is, something needs to be responsible for making sure everybody gets there. But these local efforts, we want to continue to encourage.
I like that. And I'm going to get to audience questions in a little bit. I like also the Energy Trust Australia. It's like an ETA, right? It's like, when do we get the good stuff? Let me know. Before I get to, see, all the engineers in the room laughed first. Alison, I'm not familiar overly with the work plan that you might have at the Grattan Institute, but if there's something that you want to be looking at in your next, if you had all the funding you needed or you had the staff that you needed to do, what's the project you want to look at that might actually contribute something real and good? I know you've done some great work on gas.
So we are planning later on this year to do a report on, at the moment the scope of it is like something demand side of the meter something. We need to figure out what that is, and part of my reason for coming to this conference was to hear, well, where should we be thinking and looking? And because, our original motivation for doing that was when the draft integrated system plan came out. You see how big the chunk of so-called demand side stuff is, and we looked at that and went, where's that going to come from? Whose job is it to make that work? Is that just like, I really liked the language you used around your kind of like natural or organic efficiency. And it's kind of like, is that just what we think the natural efficiency is, or is that something we actually have to actively go after? I have worked on energy efficiency on and off for a long time, and it is really bloody difficult stuff to get. It's been this persistent thing that people have been wanting to go after since the 1970s, and so much of it is still hanging around. And so there's something there, and I'll
just jump in here. I think this is what's hard. So I live in a small strata building. We have to take out the trash every week, like the 5 units in our building. And no one did it. It was like this awful issue where people weren't taking out the bins. And then we decided to make someone responsible. And so it's, one unit every month has responsibility for taking out the bins. Now it almost always happens, and if it doesn't, you know who's to blame. And so that's the issue with energy efficiency. It's hard to get, but Michael's got lots of ideas for how to get it and how they've gotten it. But we don't make anyone responsible for getting it. Yeah. That's the issue.
I think that is a sort of a theme that just kept coming through again and again and again, was that like we know what works, right? We know that it needs to be tailored. We know it needs to be specific to people's specific circumstances. I was sort of finding it, I guess, somewhat frustrating, but also just thinking like when you're inside a government, you're kind of, you don't want to do that stuff. That's hard. Minister doesn't want that. I think, who was it who raised the fact that they want like a 1-year thing with a high-vis vest on the front of it, right? And so there has to be a way that we can get this and to make it someone's job. We've had ministers for energy efficiency before, and we haven't necessarily got somewhere. It's got to be more than just a job title. It's got to find its way down there. And I think also we need to value it. And that's one of the things that I want to unpick in a report is go, what's this stuff worth? I work with a bunch of economists who continually tell me there are no $20 notes lying on the street. I'm kind of like, this stuff is actually, it's not a $20 note lying on the street. It's $20 worth of 5-cent pieces that are all over the place, but are still valuable. There's still $20 there. How are we going to go and get them?
There's a great story about Steven Spielberg. He got bullied a lot when he was a kid, and people used to throw money at him, and he collected it all and bought a bicycle. And I was the same. Once I started earning money, I grew up quite poor, and I just stopped. I just gave all my change to mum because I never wanted to deal with coupons or 20-cent pieces again, even when it was actually at my disadvantage. I think that naturally transitions because we do want, whose job is it? And there's a question here for Ron, which I'll start with, Ron, which is, are our regulators still fit for purpose? There are so many A's. There's the AER, the AEMO, finding AEMO, AEMC. I don't even know. I think I could guess what AEMC is, but what are they doing, Ron? And we love them all very equally.
Yeah, I keep getting asked this question. It's the wrong question.
Of course it is.
Because they were set up at a time for a purpose when we had a very clear view of the challenge, right? People ask, why doesn't energy efficiency happen, right? Because all of this has not been designed to deliver it. It's as simple as that. This is a volume-based business. Produce volume, deliver it. It would happen if we changed just a few minor things. Like if we said to a distribution network, for example, you are not allowed to, we're going to put a cap on how much load you can how much energy you can draw from the supply side of the market. Suddenly energy efficiency would be a clear objective. And if you draw more power than you need to, I'm not sure if it's energy or power, you'll know the answer to that. You're going to get penalised, right? Now, I know. It's easy to joke. Yes, of course, you don't think that's the question, right? But it isn't the question because the institutions we've set up. I made a joke. I was on a panel just before Christmas, and I can't remember what the question was, but I came up with this answer, which I thought was really clever.
That's because you didn't answer it right.
Which was, the problem we have at the moment is the AMC is going through a bit of an identity crisis, and that the AR is not. Right? And it's not their fault, right? They've been set up to do something, and the world has just flipped around in ways. So we've got to just want to yell, stop. Everyone just stop for a moment. Let's think this through carefully. Let's work out how we redesign things. What are the limits of what can be done? And let's.
I feel like that's an interesting, you're nodding a lot, Michael. Is that because you agree completely?
No, actually, it kind of explains something, I think, that because, as an outsider sort of looking in, and of course with, 3 days of crash course introduction.
Most of our politicians, you're fine.
Fair enough. I think one of the things that I've been looking for and I've asked about and I haven't seen or heard yet is sort of what is the value proposition of energy efficiency in Australia? Why is it important to do efficiency? In Oregon, our question was answered, 25 years ago when they said, because it's the least cost resource, it's the cheapest thing for customers, utilities, you will maximize efficiency before you start looking at any other generation source, right? That was the answer. The beautiful thing about efficiency, it's got all kinds of other benefits to it, right? And that could be your value prop. I guess it's just sort of where does it fit and why is it important? Is it a social good construct that is important to make sure that energy is affordable for everybody? Is it a system benefit in the sense that it's the cheapest, least cost, very predictable and reliable resource? Is it a decarbonization tool and it's critical to your decarbonization goals and that's what we're going to key in on? What is the value proposition for efficiency? Has that conversation been had? And are you all speaking with the same voice when you talk? Because again, I don't know the political system here, but I suspect in any sort of democracy, if there's enough people talking to the elected officials and saying this is what we want and why we want it, they'll eventually do it.
I was just
maybe that's
to react
naive,
to that a bit because that was something that was playing on my mind when we were talking about one-stop shops and that sort of stuff, is that in the current political environment, for anything to get up, you need a coalition of people and a very diverse range of voices from and voices that will be heard and respected on both sides of politics, you need to have them behind that idea. And so there's a lot of people in this room who I think are part of a coalition, but it really struck me when Simon was talking that you need the chambers of commerce and industry behind this saying, no, we want this thing. You need the Business Council of Australia saying, no, this thing is valuable. You need to have that. If you don't have that coalition behind your idea, it just doesn't make it through the politics, because when you've got that really big coalition, it actually just becomes it becomes impossible for a politician to not respond to it, because they're just being hit from so many directions with people saying, no, do this thing. Do this thing. It matters. It matters to me.
There's almost a reactive streak in some part. Like, I'm back in regional Queensland, and there are people who are buying bigger cars not for any reason other than to spite someone who's too woke.
Yeah.
Like, they really are. Like, it's become so built into the conversation. I don't know, Brian, whether you've got thoughts about how to overcome that, because it feels intractable to me at the moment, but I'm cynical.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a Novocastrian. I live in Newcastle. I was surprised to hear all these. I wasn't that surprised to hear all of these terrible things that are happening in Newcastle. But I mean, this is the thing about Newcastle. There's this idea of a Novocastrian. Yesterday was Valentine's Day. You've heard of a French kiss? There's a Novocastrian kiss. Not heard of this? It's a headbutt. So I think I do think that there's. So I think Michael actually just identified the three main value propositions of energy efficiency, which are it's the least cost resource, it makes solving climate change easier, faster, better, and it provides a whole host of additional benefits. I think this. We were talking, or I was talking about, this idea of who's responsible, and we needed an Energy Trust of Australia or something like that, some entity who's responsible. But I think in many ways the question is who's responsible for creating that, and I think unfortunately that's all of us, right? So that's why you were all invited, and some of you came. Sorry.
That's why we left the afternoon free, so that you could get on the job.
I want to get back to audience questions. And this one's been the most upvoted, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this. Do consumers or customers need to understand the complexity of the system, or does the system need to be less complex? I suspect there is a meeting in the middle there.
I'll stop talking after this one, but sure. Unfortunately, I spent too much time at the CSIRO to think that the energy system needs to be less complex. I mean, the reality is that this is the biggest machine in Australia. It's one of the most complicated machines in the world, and it is being redesigned while it provides electricity to everybody. It's only going to get more complex before it gets less complex. Consumers don't need to understand any of that.
It's kind of like the operating system of a computer, like a graphical user interface.
I mean, it's like there are a huge number of systems that support your life, right? The global system behind those mints on the table is incredibly complicated, but you don't need to know how that works to enjoy the mint. I have eaten too many mints this morning. But that's modernity. Modernity is supported by complicated systems, and you don't necessarily need to, and you don't have the brain space to understand how.
So many people just reach for a mint. Which is the other thing,
So I mean, I think it is hard to make the system less complex, but what you need to make simple is where people interact with the system. That needs to be easy to use and easy to navigate and responsive to people's needs. And if you make that happen, just like it's very easy to get a mint, it needs to be just as easy to get onto the energy transition. And if you make that happen, it doesn't matter how much complexity there is in the black box, in the big machine. What word are we using? Customers, people, citizens will be fine.
Human beings is one of the other questions, so shouldn't we just talk about people? I want to ask this question, and I'll throw it open to the panel, but there's a question that says 8 to 10% of retail bills are for state energy efficiency schemes. I don't actually know if that's true. I'm sure it is. How can this be better utilised across the NEM, the National Energy Market?
So back in 2010, when I was working in the federal government, we had a very long project to see whether we could have a national energy efficiency scheme like the state one. So, Michael, for your benefit, these are so-called white certificate schemes. So obligations on the energy retailers, find a certain amount of energy efficiency every year. The way you find it is with a tradable certificate that's awarded. It was really hard to get that up because of the differences between states. So, you know, what state governments worried about was that this was going to come onto bills, but the activity, because of the way we had set those schemes up, because it's around a tradable certificate that delivers you with an economically efficient outcome, the activity and the benefits were all going to cluster in certain states where there was lots of low-hanging fruit, and consumers in other states would have to pay for it. So if you want to have schemes like this, they need to be single state-based schemes to get around that barrier. And I think there's also a question about how much are those actually delivering for people and how visible is it? Because some of them, particularly the New South Wales one, that's been there since, Chris Bangaro, I'm looking at you, 2003?
Something like that.
Yeah, in one form or another. But there's not a lot of visibility about how much that's delivered for New South Wales consumers across that, 20 years of time.
Yeah, I hadn't even heard of them before, and that's a reflection on me, I'm sure. A poor one.
If you ever got a free box of light bulbs at a railway station?
No. That sounds like the beginning
that was one
of
of those, or someone who came and knocked on your door and said, I'm changing light bulbs and shower heads in the house.
I've heard about that, yes.
Yes, that was one of those.
I mean, there is a little bit of kind of flack given to some of these programs about, probably because of pink bats, about governments, incentivising these things. But I must say that growing up in a single-parent household in poverty, the best thing that ever happened to my mum, who was lucky enough to buy a house for 70 grand in my hometown, in the year 2000, was solar. Like, that saved her life and ours. So, these things have a role to play, I would have thought, but maybe that's just me. I don't want to, while you're here, Michael, I want to ask about, we've had the discussion about the one-stop shop, which now needs to be a multi-stop hub. And I've done some work on aged care and home care and the similar model that Ash was talking about, where, this complicated system was explained to people in communities at the local shop or at the takeaway joint and where they congregated, because that's where they are. How did you do that in Oregon to find the communities that are hard to reach?
To be perfectly honest, when we first started, we didn't.
Yep.
And it wasn't really until around 2014-ish or so that we really realized, hey, these programs we're putting out there, even though we say anybody can get a rebate on, an efficient furnace, there were definitely parts of the market communities who are not participating, who are not benefiting from clean energy. I think this is becoming more of an obvious statement nowadays, as especially when we listen to the experiences from the folks in the last panel. But it took us a while to realize it. And that was because, why? I mean, Energy Trust originally was predominantly white and predominantly male, and predominantly middle and upper class, right? And so we designed programs for white, middle, upper class males.
Yep.
And then we're surprised.
You were probably very good at it.
We were extremely good at it.
Yeah. See, that experience matters.
And then we turned around and we're surprised when communities of color and rural communities and customers experiencing lower incomes were not participating in our programs. And so we've had to pivot, and we've really had, and quite honestly, it was one of the things that really attracted me to this position when it became available, because it wasn't a conversation we were having in the energy industry at the time.
Yeah.
And I worked in New York, which was one of the most progressive states in this space, and we weren't having that conversation, and Energy Trust
New York,
was.
yeah.
And it was fascinating to me, and it really shifted the perspective and made us rethink, and that's where the whole conversation around language and customer versus consumer comes from. And we have had to completely, basically adopt all the advice we just heard from the panelists before, right? So how do you take this from a transaction to a relationship?
And have you seen a pickup in the...
Absolutely.
Yep.
We are definitely starting to bring new customers, these customers we've historically underserved, what we refer to as our priority customers. And they are participating more now, but that's because we're working through these community organizations that have already established trust, as I mentioned before, empowering them. And sometimes, yes, it is just a matter of transcreating materials so that we're using imagery and language that resonates with different cultures. But a lot of times, too, what we're learning, and still honestly trying to figure out how to adapt to, is how to really co-create program offerings and solutions with these communities. And I think, we still have a lot to learn, and we have a lot better work that we need to be doing. But I'm glad we're on that path. I'm glad we're having those hard conversations. Trust comes from being transparent and admitting your failures as much as being successful, right?
It's the only thing that works. And the open board meetings and things like that is such a tonic, honestly, given some of the stuff I see every day. I'm going to do, I'm sorry, I just started thinking about mints and where they come from. I want to do final reflections, and I'm going to base it off the most upvoted question that we've got left, which is what has been missing from the conference in the last couple of days? I'll start with you, Alison, and we'll work our way down.
I think the thing that's been missing is what's the next step. And maybe that's because we're all struggling to articulate it, but there's lots of bubbling good ideas. I think there's a reasonable amount of consensus on stuff that needs to happen, but what is the next step here that makes all of that stuff happen and grow and so on? I feel like that, to me, is what I haven't necessarily...
We just bring Michael to Australia permanently, I think, but...
Yeah. Could we just take his passport before he leaves?
Yeah.
You're joking like I wouldn't just stay. Yes, let me go back to 40 degrees Fahrenheit and rain.
We also have some very lovely lakes. Ron, what are we missing? What hasn't come up?
Gosh, it's complicated.
You can...
Right, so let me answer a different question. So what should we call them? So I'm just looking at this backboard here. I think Energy Prisoners Australia. So, the state motto of Oregon was she flies with her own wings, correct? Yes. Whereas across the country in New Hampshire, the state motto is live free or die, right? Which is, it's out there, right? Because we are so dependent, or not so dependent, because we are totally dependent on this thing called the energy system, we are prisoners of it, right? If we weren't, we wouldn't be having this discussion, because we could just walk away, right? We don't have, Ice Cream Consumers Australia, right? We don't have, Mint Consumers Australia, right? The reason we have Energy Consumers Australia, the reason we have Super Consumers Australia, right? Superannuation Consumers Australia, is because we are prisoners of this system. And it's recognising that and honestly recognising it, and honestly recognising that because we are prisoners of the system, someone has an obligation to us. The problem that we have, which I think Brian might have raised, which who exactly is responsible?
But I think that's a fair point, but again, the only prison really is the one that we create in our minds.
Where do you live?
Queensland.
So I would say quickly that I think maybe divergent view is the wrong thing. Some of these people who love gas still and really think that there's a future for hydrogen or something. I think within this room, it's often sometimes it was just like, well, of course everyone agrees. And so I do think that, reflecting back on it, it would have been good to just introduce more divergence or challenging questions.
Yeah. Well, that's a reflection on me as well. Michael, before you head back to Oregon, do you have any parting advice for us?
Yeah. Well,
Don't stuff it up.
No, listen, I think I've really been taken, the questions that we've been asked. So I'm here with my colleague Amber Cole, who is our Director of Communications and Customer Service. And the questions we've been asked are all the right questions. It's just been absolutely amazing and refreshing in a lot of ways to see the enthusiasm. There's a lot of alignment, obviously, a lot of buzz. Yeah, you don't maybe have all the answers right now. So what? Like, you're asking the right questions, and it's great to see, actually. I personally, my personality is that I love this space. I love when things are a little messy and divergent still. It's right before clarity hits and convergence comes around, and you settle on a solution and work for it. Because this is where you hear people, you hear voices, you hear ideas. That innovative space is, I love this area. I'm really jealous of all the work you all have to do.
Take his passport.
Yeah.
Because it's the great, right. So yeah, I just keep doing it. I mean, you're totally in a very enviable position.
We are all Esperants in the burning platform. Thank you so much to the panel. I really appreciate your insights. That was really fun. Hopefully it was valuable as well. I'll let you all leave the stage.